Good evening. It's lovely to have everybody here in this beautiful room. Am I doing okay? I'm Newcomb Stillwell. I'm one of the trustees, and I'm delighted to welcome Alex Green to discuss his new book, A Perfect Turmoil, Walter E. Fernald and the Struggle to Care for America's Disabled. This is one of a regular series of programs we have every year on all kinds of topics. We have a leading collection in the country on the history of disability, and that's what led us to be so excited about Alex's book. But if people are interested in that topic, you can come here and do research and read things anytime you want. It's free and open to everybody. And we have programs on all kinds of stuff. This year, we're doing a lot of stuff relating to the revolution, which is very interesting, all different aspects of it. Alex is a remarkable guy. He has spent decades trying to uncover the truth about Fernald and the institution and stuff. And as you can imagine, since it's to say the least, a checkered history, and the records were in the arms of the Commonwealth's government, this was a labor of many years and much love and I'm sure endless frustration. And the field of disability studies and disability legislation owes him a great debt. He teaches political communications at Harvard Kennedy School. He's a visiting fellow at the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. He's a visiting scholar at Brandeis's Lurie Institute for Disability Policy. He's a widely recognized advocate and historian on disability matters, and he was the author of the first of its kind landmark legislation on creating a disability human rights commission, which led me to sort of channel a well-known comedian and ask, what are you compensating for? Anyway, we're really thrilled that you're here, Alex, and we look forward very much to your talk.
Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you so much to the Mass Historical Society for having me, to Olivia Saya for making this possible. And to those of you online, thank you for zooming in here to watch this tonight. I'm going to try to go through an enormous amount of stuff in a very short period of time, because I want to share a little bit from the book. I also want to share, obviously, a little bit about the process. Some time for questions, because I know that many people have very significant connections both to the Fernald and to the hundreds of institutions that we now know existed largely because the Fernald School, Walter Fernald School, existed in the first place. And that impact is obviously enormous and impacts millions of people. We'll run out of time. On the last slide, I am going to leave my email address, and if you can bear with the fact that I am a painfully slow correspondent, that'll be a way also to get a hold of me. And during Q&A, just to preface things, because of that, I will ask that people be sort of short with questions, even though I know you may have a lot to share, just in the interest of time, and also because our dive into some of this. And really what I want to talk about is the book and Walter Fernald and the process of how I came to this, because I think the questions that I had are questions I've heard again and again from people who've lived in institutions by the hundreds. Myself briefly was institutionalized, all the way to people who worked in them by the hundreds of thousands, and family members and descendants and beyond. Couple of things. I'm going to show some images. My language, I'm going to use some really horrible terminology. There's no way around it, really, because a lot of the terms that come out of this history don't really have synonyms today. And I'm very, very wary of trying to say that a term from the past has a rough synonym today, because there's obviously dangers in doing that. And so the downside to that is I'm going to say things that sound very hurtful. Last thing, these terms change all the time. You'll see on the first page of my book that I have a quote from Walter Fernald wrestling with whether or not to call the people who live under his care or in his institution, or however you want to describe it, patients, inmates, pupils. This is a challenge. You are not expected in your questions to have perfect terminology when you ask things. And I know we're all figuring this out. I may simply offer in my response how I think we're using those terms today. And I understand that they change, and I understand that it's hard to learn all of those. And so those are some of my kind of ground rules. Let's start big with this. Our broad conception of institutions in general is asylums. Here we have on the left side, Jack Nicholson yelling out. I'm also going to describe images here just because for folks who have visual impairments. Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and on the right, American Horror Story, and this person walking through this asylum. Our view is of places that are institutions for people with mental illness, but that has masked an entirely separate history of what were called at one point the state schools. And here we have a map. You can see the overlay. I'm trying with a colleague to map every single one of these institutions and tell a brief history of them, which is yet another compensate for project that is bonkers, but I think is a need to do. But they existed everywhere by the hundreds, all over the United States, in towns and cities and all over the place. And they have a very different history. And that history all goes back to this institution that Walter Fernald ran, that was created by this dude on the left, the gray beard, long hair, suit, 1850s, 40s in this, probably 50s in this. Someone in here will probably know. Samuel Gridley Howe, who was kind of a swashbuckling figure of the 1800s. He was a doctor who also went to Europe and fought in the Greek Civil War because he thought he could be Lord Byron, and came back, got arrested in Germany for fomenting civil war, came back, ran the Perfect School for the blind, got it off the ground, was really sort of a founding figure there. And obviously there are stories tied to that, working with Laura Bridgman, a very famous case about teaching people with visual impairments. And later on, one of the Secret Six who ran guns to John Brown, and was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau at the end of the Civil War, but called his greatest accomplishment creating a small room in the 1840s inside of the Perkins School called the Massachusetts Experimental School for Idiotic and Feeble-Minded Youth, that came out of trying to treat someone who he thought had something more than just a visual impairment. This is the school when it was in South Boston. And Howe left us with this kind of warning late in his life after he saw people mimicking the school that he created, which the idea was to have people come and go each year, learn something, and then go. And this building, you know, one single sort of 3-story building, he was seeing them turn them into larger and larger places. And he warned us, he said, that institutions are unnatural, undesirable, and very liable to abuse. We should have as few of them as possible, and those few should be kept as small as possible. The human family, he said, is the unit of society. Now, we didn't listen to that, and we ended up with a large number of institutions, obviously, all over that warehoused large numbers of people. And this is what I knew of the very little of what the Fernald School really was about, was a history of scandal. This is these two pictures on the left and right, one of men seated on the floor with a drain, most of them naked in the room with their eyes blacked out, a child chained to a bench with urine on the floor, are from a 1960s book called Christmas in Purgatory, of photos snuck out of institutions, including Fernald. And in the middle, this Boston Sunday Globe from the early 1990s, radiation used on the retarded, a radiation scandal in which the institution used radioactive tracers in the oatmeal of boys who were told they were part of the science club without telling them that they were being experimented on. This is the kind of generally known story of this place. Through a total accident, I ended up with the keys to the Fernald School in 2014. I work as a negotiation writer in part of my work. That was how I was hired at Harvard originally. And I was roped into being on all of you know New England, my local town civic duty to join the Historic Commission, because I like history. And I was asked when Deval Patrick started selling off the properties of the former institutions that were closing to towns, to help my city look at the historical aspects of negotiating the contract of buying the Fernald School from the state. It's one of, I think, 5 or 6 institutions that were all on a row there: the Met State Hospital, the Gabler School, the McLean, Middlesex, exactly. And as Fernald was closing down and the state was moving its last 14 people out, back to the 14 that Howe started with, I had the keys to the entire place suddenly. And I stood at the top of the hill where Walter Fernald's house was, and I thought, what the hell is this place? And I started walking through it with a friend who is a documentary filmmaker and an animator who teaches at Rhode Island School of Design, pictured here looking down a chute in a building. Many of the buildings were actually in great condition. It deteriorated over time, but you can see how it deteriorated, which is a very dangerous place, finding records in all the buildings, climbing through things falling apart as they went. That glass there of me going up the stairs is all bullet holes. So these sites had become, by that point, attractive to neo-Nazis who celebrate the history of these places as places where they think eugenics, the killing of disabled people, was successfully practiced. And I kept wondering, who is Walter Fernald? We keep saying the name of this guy, but who is Walter Fernald? And I talked to him, former employees, tons of people. Everybody says, I don't know, it's out beyond the bad old days, but this is the myth that I heard of Walter Fernald: a relatively inconsequential institution manager and propagandist, a rigid and cruel eugenicist, a sterilization advocate with committing tons of sterilizations, an intelligence testing person who had at the last moment just a little bit of an about face before he died. And here is Walter at his peak, looking very serious and bemustached. I went looking, and the first article that I could find about Fernald was this, which was very tantalizing: "Flags at half-staff for Dr. W.E. Fernald, Boston Globe when he died." And I thought, who lowers the flags of a state for an institutional superintendent? Like, what was this guy? And that made me very, very curious. So I went to the state archives and I said, you know, the Fernald School had the largest library on intellectual and developmental disabilities in the world when it closed. So 196 acres, dozens of buildings. This place was massive. And the library was Walter Fernald's baby. And I said, I've been told everything's been destroyed except the books, which went to Brandeis. But if you have anything at all, I would love to see it at the state archives. And the archivist looked at me and like as an alien and said, we have 65 boxes of Walter Fernald's correspondence alone. She said, but here are 2 catches. Everything is out of order by page. The Works Progress Administration went in. They tried to reorganize this meticulous man's writing into their own system, ran out of money, threw everything back in the boxes. So one page will be from 1887, the next is 1910, the next is 1924, the next is 1890. We can't tell you. She said, second problem, everything that is deemed a medical record in Massachusetts is protected in perpetuity, no matter how old. If you had a loved one who was in a hospital in Massachusetts in 1810, A, we couldn't even tell you if we had a record on them. B, if you want to know if there's a record, you have to go to probate court. You have to have them send a letter to all living descendants of the person mentioned. Nobody can object. And then if you are appointed the executor of that estate, we can tell you if there is anything anyway. So what that means for this collection is, because it's about so many people, we're going to have to redact everything in advance, which means we have to read everything first. And that's what you see on the right-hand side, red page with names redacted, listing whether they were an idiot, an imbecile, or a moron, the terms for the day. They said, so you're going to start with 1 box, if that's okay. And I said, sure, start with 1 box. You can see the look on the face of the man pushing the cart there. That's their general feeling toward me. Here's what I found inside. I was told that this place was like Auschwitz. So this is a very confusing set of images. Here we have architectural plans that are gorgeous. They were done by someone who was a renowned architect. A photo of Walter Fernald looking pretty slick in the middle, 2 classrooms filled with children. One is a gym, the other is a formal classroom. And they're in suits, right? They're dressed. These things look rather fancy. And in the bottom left here, a matron in her white dress with a very little kid in her white dress. This does not look to me like Auschwitz. What is this? Was sort of my question. The problem, by my math, after 5 years of work, it was going to take 47 more years of work to get them to redact everything in time. And they were as frustrated as I was. So someone quietly said on a phone call from the state, someone could try to sue us. So I went around and I found a very nice pro bono law firm, Wilmer Hale, and we filed a really nasty complaint. And we said that this law is unjust and it makes no sense. And I had some supporters in the state to help make that happen. And they backed down very, very quickly. And the first thing they tried to do was redact everything with everyone in the building. They gave up on that. And they sent everything over to the Department of Developmental Services. And for 90 days in a summer a few years ago, I had a key to an office surrounded by lawyers so that I don't do any disclosure that I shouldn't do. And I read everything that I could read out of this 250,000 page thing, and tried to make sense of what I found. And this is what I found. In this image are just some glimpses of the things that tell you what the Fernald School was. On the top left, John Dewey, the renowned educator, asking for Fernald's annual report so that he can have it in his library. On the bottom left, a letter from William James, the first psychologist in America, asking if he can bring his experimental psychology class out to visit for their annual visit from Harvard. A postcard from Japan from a school updating Fernald on his advice on how they were building out the school. Almost flipped the page right past B.T. Washington because I'm a fool, without recognizing that that was Booker T. Washington asking for Fernald to send his annual report for his library. A letter from John Harvey Kellogg asking a bizarre set of questions, though anyone who knows John Harvey Kellogg's story, this will not surprise you, about the bowel movements of disabled people. Everything in the world coming Fernald's way. This is the arc of Walter Fernald's story. He's a utopian. This is at its root a moral fable about somebody who says, I want to help people. He's a young doctor from Maine, and he decides when he shows up in 1887 and finds this school that was once the joy of the nation that could teach intellectually disabled people as part of the link, not as an asylum, but a link in the chain of common public schools, was what they said. Get them out of the city and really build a place where he could protect them from an increasingly ugly world. And he says in this paragraph up on the screen, basically to just sum it up, kids should have fun. They should be able to get outside. They should have swings. Disabled kids deserve to, every kid who shows up at the school is required to have only one of two things. The rest they'll figure out and take care of: a doll or a sled, or you will be given one. Right? He's got this view that he's got to turn this into a place where kids can stay and grow up and have a place to live where they learn some stuff. And he radically reinvents what the educational methods are that are done for this, because he's able to synthesize things really beautifully. He pulls things together from all these different ideas out in the world and comes up with new educational methods that are highly successful, and word spreads, as you could see. All of these people who were looking to this institution. Here's a view inside the institution. This is the gym. These are girls doing exercise. This is one of the first places, the playground. Like, the idea of the playground was created in Boston just a couple of years before this opened. A gym where you could do physical education. He believes that if you enhance your senses, if we teach you to enhance your senses, each of your separate senses, your touch, your smell, your sight, they will all arrive at what? What's in the middle? Does anybody know? They will build out your common sense. That's where this idea comes from, that they will build your common sense. So here's exercise for these folks. He gets people who are coming here who are people with some of the most complex disabilities to be able to live in that world. And it is an ugly world to be a disabled person in at that time. These are from a medical textbook that I tracked down, where I realized that they were images of people from within Fernald, in suits and clothes, dignified, trying. A classroom here of kids looking forward. The biggest thing for Fernald, object lessons, a cabinet of things to enhance those senses, spices and toys and things that are rough or smooth, have strong smells, build up all of these senses, workshops to teach people woodworking. Also work. They build the institution, a very complex idea for us to think about now. These are boys building the road in front of the gym. Now I think we would call that a different kind of labor. Boys with guns, a belief, these are not real guns, marching, but a belief that they could see themselves as soldiers, that they could serve in the military. A band. At one point, the person teaching music there he wrote the scores for Gilbert and Sullivan. It was a place for pride of place to teach at a place like this. It was known the world over for this. And not hiding their disabilities, free, as Fernald would say, from the jeers of people outside. But Fernald starts to get worried about this. And as his prominence rises and word spreads around the world that this place is what it is, and people visit more and more, he's wrestling with something because Fernald has a very similar mental illness to me. He has depression, he has anxiety, he collapses at points and can't work. And he has periods where he gets very dark and gets very conspiratorial. And that's not helped when two girls murder someone in the institution. Because Fernald has stopped letting people out every time. He believes that some people have what he says are no friends to go back to in the world. And what do we do if someone has no friends to go back to in the world? We'll give them something here to do for the rest of their lives. He built out Colony Plantation. West of here, 90, 60 miles west of his institution, to where young men work on the land. And he starts to have this very, very dark idea that maybe there are some people whose mischief, violence, sexuality, bad behavior, maybe that's a disability too. And maybe that is an expression of their disability. And this happens to be a really bad moment for that idea to come in because eugenics is arriving right at that moment that says there's a science behind this. And Fernald is obsessed with creating this idea that he thinks exists called the defective delinquent, which is at the root of the term moron. And his protege, Henry Goddard, who looks up to him, creates the term moron based on this idea that someone can be a defective delinquent. They can have an intellectual disability, a defect that makes them delinquent. He says in a very dark way, this early intensive study of the feeble-minded and his family and environment and habits and morals gradually assembled some very depressing information. A composite portrait he's writing later about what he came to view. Portrait of a mythical person embodying all the bad qualities of many defectives appeared as the hero of what I like to call the legend of the feeble-minded, and conveyed the impression that the feeble-minded were almost all of highly hereditary class, so they're passing it down from one to the next, degenerating the human species. They were almost invariably immoral. Most of the women bore illegitimate children. Nearly all were antisocial, vicious, and criminal. They were all idle and shiftless and seldom supported themselves. They were highly dangerous people roaming up and down the earth, seeking whom they might destroy. The feeble-minded person, and I think this lasts well beyond his lifetime because of what he did, became an object of horror and aversion. He was looked upon as an Ishmaelite, a useless, dangerous person who should be ostracized, sterilized, and segregated for his natural life at the public expense. And Fernald is at the center of this because he is being recognized in this era as the Montessori of America. And Maria Montessori, who is a eugenicist, is becoming very famous. And in the preface to her first book, as the educator that she becomes, the guy who writes it, who's a Harvard professor, says, you know, Walter Fernald's doing this all right down the road and has been doing it for ages, but he doesn't do it with gifted kids. He does it with kids with disabilities. These are two young women dressing up for a dance at the Fernald School in that era where he talks that way about them. These are young women. What's that? I can definitely. These are young women who are in the band. Notice their ages. They're being kept for the length of their childbearing life. This is the farm sustaining this. Boys working every aspect of this, young men working every aspect of this, and increasingly old men, every aspect of this. Fernald has an about face because of a deep moral conviction that sterilization is wrong. It's wrong morally. It's wrong also as a public health measure. He's a doctor. And he believes that what it will lead to, and he sees cases of this, is that if you send someone home to a community after sterilizing them, and the community knows it, they will sexually abuse that person. And then they will spread sexually transmitted diseases everywhere. So from public health to the just deep moral end, he starts to worry that the company he keeps as one of the three leaders of this movement in the country are bad people doing bad work that is shoddy. And he sits on it for a while because he doesn't know what to do. Much of the book follows that transformation. This is him at his greatest understatement in 1924, right before he dies, telling all of his colleagues they may have made a terrible mistake. It is possible that in the past, we have a bit overstressed the protection of the public welfare and understressed the obligation of society to its less endowed members to their great disadvantage. And he says this thing that is a word that we have a different one for now. The ultimate responsibility for the care and training of the feeble-minded must be decentralized, by which he means deinstitutionalization. And he calls for the radical deconstruction of the movement that he helped build the world over. When he first panics and he can't figure out because he's a master policymaker and he makes all the laws that we still deal with the vestiges of. An example being if you saw the military being used, the National Guard, in the subways of New York State a couple of years ago to deal with mentally ill people. They used something that was called the Mental Deficiency Act of 1919. Fernald's language is all over that thing, right? His laws persist into the present day. He can't get around his own laws. He can't get people out of his institution even when he wants to. So one of the ways he starts to do it is he helps break young men out to go fight in World War I. He says, look, if this place really works the way we thought it was supposed to, then you should be able to fight. I don't know if you'll fight. I don't know if you'll cook. I don't know if you carry stuff, but go, get out of here. This is Ernest Lambert, who I've been able to track down, and his World War I photo given to the Boston Globe. He served with distinction, lived the rest of his life outside of the institution. Despite that understated comment, this is how this was seen at the time. Fernald gets more and more vehement because he's proving and owning publicly that he may have been terribly wrong by finding people who broke out of the institution and seeing that they're doing okay. And this reads, this is from, I think, 1922, to abolish homes for the feeble-minded in a very haunting language. Walter Fernald, superintendent of the Mass State School and Colony at Waverly, in an address in Boston, predicted that 3 generations hence, almost all institutions for the feeble-minded will have been abolished, and the care of this type entrusted to community and colony life. And the 3 generations thing we'll obviously come back to. Here's what I came away with in a nutshell. And obviously there's a whole book to this, but this is Walter Fernald with E.R. Johnstone, who was a major figure in A.C. Rogers. They ran institutions. These are the big ones. Vineland in New Jersey in the middle, and Faribault in Minnesota on the right. And just behind Balding, Henry Goddard, who not only coins the term moron, but brings the IQ test to America as the Binet-Simon test and crafts it in consultation as he's looking at it, talking a lot with Fernald as he goes. The reality of Fernald, very different. A world-renowned institution builder, policymaker, and propagandist. He created special education as we know it in public schools. 7.5 million kids today under a program whose origins we did not know until this book. He's known as the Montessori of America. He was a rigid and cruel eugenicist. He was also the first successful legal opponent of sterilization and of intelligence testing in many regards. He was a founding faculty member of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which they didn't know. He mentored the first woman to get her doctorate from Harvard. And he did a years-long campaign to dismantle eugenics institutions and cruelty to the disabled near the end of his life. After he dies, and this is some of what the book gets into, obviously things change, and that's not an accident now that we know that he was the main legal opponent to sterilization. Within years of his death, Buck versus Bell is approved by the U.S. Supreme Court, which says that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. and allows for the forcible sterilization of the disabled in the country. The SAT is unleashed, which is based on the IQ test. But the dismantling of eugenics continues to be actually the force against it, led by this guy, Abraham Myerson, based out of the Fernald, proteges he left behind who continue to do work and say, this is wrong and it's pseudoscience, and they're debunking it. You know, in the decades after that, we start to move into the world that we know. But I think the hard thing to reckon with about this history is that it tells us that after World War II, this place was worse. During the Great Depression, this place was worse. It got worse than what Walter Fernald had said it would be originally. It got worse. And much of what many of you probably came into, if you saw these things in your own work and lives, starting in the 60s, was actually the dovetail of the collapse of these institutions. The worst of the worst of the worst, if such a comparison is even possible. By 1967, more than 200,000 Americans were locked in state schools and developmental centers. It's on top of the more than 500,000 people who were in asylums. We set about trying to fix institutions after that. We latched onto this idea that deinstitutionalization, letting people out, failed, and we did an incomplete job then of deinstitutionalization. And the COVID pandemic really showed how that continues to impact our populations. It's killed a lot of people. And now I think we're back around to this idea of institutionalization, which is really scary. The impact of this is real. These are people around me. There's a cemetery out in the woods north of Waltham, like there are at many of these institutions, where people are buried under a letter and a number and nothing more from the institutional cemetery. And those are siblings of people. This is John Scott. His brother David never knew where he was buried. We were able to find that grave, and finally, after half a century, David knows where his brother was buried. He died at the Fernald in the early 70s. But when these places began closing down, people really started to walk away, and a lot was left behind that was undone. Records were left behind by the gazillions in these institutions. And one of the things I said on my way out the door of the Department of Developmental Services after they gave me the access to the records was, it shouldn't be the case that you have, if you're disabled like me, that you teach at Harvard and you have all the right bona fides to be able to say, I want to see these things. It should be something that people can reckon with more broadly. And a group of us across the state got together and started saying, and I'll come back to some of this later, a group of us started saying, we want to see what's inside of all of these institutions and all their records, I'm sorry. And we created a special commission, as was mentioned before, led by disabled people, the first thing in the world of its kind, led by disabled people. And in December, we were able to get the governor to at least begin to open up records. And what you can see here in these images are millions and millions of records, probably more than 10 million records is our best guess so far, all about the lives of individuals who lived in institutions, died in institutions, stories that were kept by the state and that were not told. But we've had some challenges, right? I want to just jump around here. The Fernald School itself has a very tricky legacy, and I think is a real example of erasure. The town, like many towns around it, thrived off of its existence, and I live in that town, and has done a lot to erase that history. This is Fernald's library, the one where all those documents were being used for a pornography shoot by vandals about 5 years ago. Those are Westboro State Hospital records being sold on eBay. We found that through the commission. And for as much as we want to talk about the advances of reforming places like the Fernald School and all these efforts that went on in the 70s and 80s to pump millions in, it's still kids in cages. You know, we have to reckon with what this really looks like. Howe's great warning that I always have in my mind: good intentions and kind impulses do not necessarily lead to wise and truly humane measures. What I'm seeing in the files now that I can open them up and start going through them are things like this that really challenge what we're being told about what we can access and what we can't access. This is the protected medical information that we were not allowed to see. This is artwork done by children from the Fernald School, kept in files labeled educational file, not medical file, that show their work from the 1910s. that were kept from public view under the guise that this is protected medical information. I don't know about you, but I don't have information like this on my ancestors. And I think most people would love to have this and not know that it's buried away in the hands of the state. And thank God the archives has been really good on this. These are the photos of people buried in that cemetery that I can now see for the first time. I love the one on the top right of the guy with the scowl. It's this old lady she was awesome, this little boy here, and this guy on the bottom left. There are 14,000 graves. The state has not given over the information on those people yet. There were 25 institutions in Massachusetts. The very first thing we did when we could open up the records in December is we went and looked at the last patient number in the register for the Fernald School. I wanted to know more than 14,000 people. More than 14,000 people came through the Fernald School during its existence from 1848 to 2014. There were hundreds of these nationwide, thousands worldwide, millions of victims. We're going to have to reckon with this, right? I want to just read for a moment about what this looked like in its vivid sort of sense, and how Fernald's influence really took shape around the world. So I'm going to read about his relationship with Henry Goddard for just a moment. I'm over a little bit of my time, but I'll take questions after that, I think, and pipe down. I don't know what else I've put in here. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So this is about Fernald and Henry Goddard again, who Goddard is the one who brings the IQ test to America. Fernald, and this is at the height of their eugenic, for a fancy historical term, broship. Fernald and Goddard were especially close in the work. Inviting Fernald to give a lecture to prospective teachers of special classes in New York, Goddard described himself as a kind of Moses, readying a god like Fernald's once wayward followers for deliverance as the people of Israel. Quote, "You recall that it took 40 years to prepare a certain group for the promised land. A few years ago, your people had not been prepared. Now we have them up to the point, and you will find an eager audience." Fernald was equally effusive in his praise and encouragement. "You are certainly a public benefactor," he told Goddard. "You are the only investigator who, in my opinion, is getting at the real root of the matter. I believe in 10 years, you will make feeble-mindedness so easily understood that even the feeble-minded will be able to know what is the matter with them." Few people remained untouched by the fervor of eugenics, which was rapidly achieving status as a social movement as much as a scientific one. In many ways, it reached a milestone in London in July of 1912 at the first International Eugenics Congress. Charles Darwin's son Leonard presided. A young Winston Churchill was the vice president, and the opening address was given by A.J. Balfour, the former prime minister. Delegations arrived from the United States, Belgium, and France, and more than 836 people were in attendance, hoping to learn and share information about the efforts to understand and propagate eugenics all over the world. Fernald could see his own hand at work in all of it, including the culmination of eugenic policy in Britain, an entire nation's policy. The Congress was the final catalyst for the passage of what became the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913. The sweeping national law was the result of the recommendations of the Royal Commission that had visited Fernald nearly a decade earlier. The law included a fourth tier of mental deficiency that echoed Fernald's work, setting apart moral imbeciles as, quote, persons who from an early age display some permanent mental defect, coupled with strong, vicious, and criminal propensities on which punishment has little or no deterrent effect. At home, Fernald was elevated to a new status, seen as the mind behind some of the most pressing social movements of the day. Julia Lathrop had been called to Washington to become the first director of the Federal Children's Bureau, effectively leading the development of new national policies on child welfare, and she sought Fernald's confidential advice on everything from individual hiring decisions to broad-based policy and strategy initiatives. Association meetings now included side meetings with governors and benefactors. In Massachusetts, reformers urged Fernald to accept an offer from the governor, one that he declined, to lead an overhaul of the prisons by becoming head of the State Prison Commission. He was invited to join the American Academy of Medicine. And in 1913, a year after his two sons, Walter Jr. and Tom, graduated from Harvard, the university awarded him an honorary master's degree. The following year, Harvard appointed him a lecturer on psychiatry. Throughout the state and beyond, he could see his worldview at work as society became aware of the problem posed by the feeble-minded. Drawn by the promise of power and respect, a class of largely educated, white, Christian women flocked to social work and psychology, flooding into the neighborhoods of Boston, Worcester, Springfield, and Brockton, where they promised suffering people that they would help them rise from under the crush of poverty. They did this in the language of Goddard's book, The Kallikak Family, sending salacious reports of depravity to Fernald, ascribing what they saw to feeble-mindedness, and imploring him to exert the firm hand of relief by breaking up whole families and scattering their members in institutions. With the characteristic certainty of her profession, social worker Grace Houghton wrote to Fernald, declaring that a girl was feeble-minded. She knew, because despite all other evidence to the contrary, the child, quote, has the excessive appetite which so often goes with feeble-mindedness. While individual workers went out into communities on behalf of aid organizations, the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children took up the work of public education, issuing a widely circulated pamphlet that called every citizen's attention to, quote, the menace of the feeble-minded. Waverly now had a waiting list, the Fernald School, of more than 1,000 people, and so many young women incarcerated in its buildings that they slept on the floors. Fernald and the trustees lived in fear of a fire or any outbreak of disease and paused admissions, but they did not question the underlying premise that created the overcrowding. Instead, they began to agitate for the construction of a third state school, this one in Western Massachusetts. This is a story that needs to be told, obviously. You can see that I have a moral trajectory in sort of what I'm looking at. There are a lot of reasons why this story hasn't been told and why it gets covered up. The biggest ones are that disabled people are not listened to, and that a lot of people speak on our behalf, and that's got to stop. There are a lot of people who worked in these institutions more than actually may have lived in them. And many of those folks have tried for years to balance a really hard story, which is that they did work that was compassionate and tried to do good, right things in a setting that was really horrible. But I have to say firmly that that's backfired very badly by affirming institutionalization in a way where that idea is still alive. And so as kind as their actions were, that narrative's got to change, or else we're in real trouble, because we have this idea alive because people were trying to tell the right story about where they saw themselves in a bigger history. But that bigger history is back on us now. And it's not good. And Massachusetts is the last New England state with large-scale institutions because we never fully let go of this idea. We have the only institution in America in it. It is funded with state money and money from other states that is a UN torture. The UN has set as a torture site for its treatment of disabled people. So things you can do. Read the book. Please share the book. It really does matter. It helps. Publishers don't want to publish books about disability history because they don't think this stuff's in here. And yet this is our history. This is how we got to where we are. And if you want to make sense of the world around you, it's the way to do it. The story, if you have stories, share the story with me. And we won't have time for a lot of that tonight, but you can always email me. The work needs support. I've had the institutional support in terms of the names and lots of nice fancy titles. There's not a lot of money in this work. A lot of us do this no matter what, but it could use just basic digital support. The archives has tens of millions of documents it can't even scan. I have a Substack where I write about the connections between this and the present day, and you can go there. And if you have stuff to share, reach out to me. I'm terribly slow, but I will get back to you. with that, I've talked long enough, and I'm sorry if I've run over, but I would love to open things up for questions. I'm grateful to you all for your time. I know this is a huge sweep of history, but thank you. One question, or one big thing. If you're going to ask a question, wait for the microphone to come to you. It's super essential for folks online who are listening and folks in the room so that they can hear you.
Could you comment during Fernald's day, what were the criteria for admission to his institution?
You know, it's a terrific question. And what the book gets into is that this is what gets us into so much trouble, is that at all these different institutions, it relied on the authority of the person in charge to diagnose what was wrong. And a big reason why Fernald became famous was because his diagnostic technique was seen as really exceptional. He creates the first outpatient clinic I can find anywhere where you just show up with your kid and say, I don't know what's going on. And he's super bothered by the fact that there's no uniform criteria. And so he's grabbing around for something and he keeps failing at it. And that's when Goddard comes in with the IQ test. And it's only years later that they're quietly sending letters to each other saying, I don't know if you noticed this, but many people can get the same score. And if they're all in the same room and you know them and I know them, you know they're very different. And this test is highly limited in what we've done. But by then, Fernald has really lost the battle. He creates what we would now call sort of a modern sense of differential diagnosis mixed with social determinants of health, a 10-step program that every doctor is supposed to follow to diagnose someone, and very pointedly puts the IQ test as last, only to be used to double check your work. But he's lost that battle at that point. You know how intelligence comparison goes in this world, and that enticing idea becomes disastrous. So it is a battle about diagnostics and technique as much as anything, and it's pretty sloppy out there, unfortunately. Yeah. And he acknowledges it at points. He writes to someone, he says, you didn't even belong in here. You just had no family. We didn't know what to do with you. I'm glad you got out. So if there's a question online, I would take one from that, and then we can go to another in the group if you want to do that. I don't want to neglect our online folks.
Yes, people are curious about where Fernald was looking for inspiration and how that affects the legacy of special education today.
Fernald looked for inspiration predominantly from the same person that Maria Montessori did. There's a guy named Edouard Séguin. He was a French physician. If you've ever seen The Wild Child or heard the story of The Wild Child, Séguin is a descendant of the doctors he's a trainee of the doctors who handled this case in the early 1800s that begins to get people looking in France at the idea that maybe driveling idiots can learn. They find this kid out in the woods in France and they say he's been raised in nature and we're going to teach him things because he's an empty mind. And Séguin is the one who starts to develop that sense training I was talking about before of like, maybe if someone is feeble-minded because they have feeble connections between their senses and their common sense, and if we can build those up, they can actually learn things and go out in the world. Fernald is obviously pushing a much more advanced version of that much later that has a whole curriculum and technique and process along with it. And look, it's very hard to say firsts in history, but I think what makes Fernald the first when it comes to special education is these teachers in Providence, Rhode Island, specifically this woman, Rhoda Eston, reach out to him and say, we want to do this in a classroom because we have these truancy schools. And it's supposed to be for kids who are acting up, but most of them seem to be disabled. And we don't want to send them to an institution. Can you help us come up with a curriculum? And that becomes the first example. And then he's asked to give advice to Boston and Springfield and New York. And it becomes the policy that becomes our kind of system of special education. It's not to say that these ideas weren't floating around, but he is the one who turns it into a policy and turns it into an expectation of public education, with really obviously mixed results because it involves as its premise at its root, then it tells us that its original ideas were about segregation. And there are big questions for all of us about whether policies that have key attributes as their original premise can be fixed if that was really built into the idea and the core. I am a radical on this at this point after all of this work. I believe in the total abolition of all segregated education of any kind. And I've taught disabled kids, and I think it's cosmetic at this point. And I guess maybe that bears saying as an emphasis point, like 1924, he died saying, scale it all the way back, people. That is really haunting for me. Like, we have not made enough progress on this. And so, no, I think some really big leaps on that, but it didn't start from a bad place, as so many, like, back to that moral fable idea. Other questions, please. Yeah. I'll let you decide.
Hi. I worked at the Fernald, and I always call it Inferno. And I've had some incredibly good, empathetic experiences,
Yep.
and some horrifying.
Yep.
And I wanted to say that what's shocking about eugenics, okay, George Bernard Shaw was in it, Margaret Sanger, but the one that gets to me the most, that slaughters me, is Helen Keller.
Yes.
Okay. Now, but the thing is, the conclusion is that this led to Hitler and the Third Reich, because the first people that got exterminated,
That's right.
okay, were people that are disabled. And the man that's named after, oh, I can't think of it now, but the opposite of the spectrum of autism.
Oh, Hans Asperger.
Asperger.
Yep.
Okay, Asperger, what I learned about it, he wasn't officially in the Nazi Party, but he had the disabled children of any degree exterminated. So you see how rotten this goes on. And this is relevant because why? What's alarming is from Trump and all these other sons of bitches, bastards, have been bringing back retardation, and they think it's wonderful to come out. So that really pisses me off more than anything.
Yeah, it should. It's so disheartening. And I think you're right. This is implicitly and explicitly tied to the rise of the Nazis in a weird way, because we didn't reckon with those connections at the time. They persisted in their own ways all over the United States and really burrowed into what we are as a society. And you see them being expressed now. And I've written about the fact that Fernald created a colony where he promised that these young men would be able to work a farm and ultimately own the land that they're working on, a promise that was never fulfilled. And that is the root of wellness farms, right? That is this present day idea that we're just going to take people out and rehabilitate them out somewhere. A big lesson I'm taking from so much of this that Fernald seemed to recognize, I guess the premise at the end of his life, sorry to ruin so much of the book, but I promise there's still more in there, is communities, not disabled people, should be held responsible for whether or not disabled people can lead equal lives. Is his fundamental premise. You hold the community responsible. And I think a good, single rule you can live with is anytime your solution to something is to send someone away, you have a very serious problem on your hand. You're starting to dance with something that gets really ugly. And we've been told it again and again and again. And I am a big believer in learning lessons of history because I don't like reinventing the wheel. I don't want to be the first one trying something. I would rather know that someone went before and listened to them. But at the root of this is a meanness and something that's got to change. I'm sorry. Other questions, please. Yeah.
We have another online question asking, what should happen to these places? You know, we see all of the
Fabulous question.
Yeah.
I don't have a single answer. I'm really, this is my own existential sort of thing. It comes to the moment with disability policy as well, where I think we had so many great advances from Jack Kennedy onward in disability policy in this country at the federal level that now we think in federal solutions all the time, and our sense training idea, but our muscles are a little bit weak on the local community stuff relative to that. We got to suddenly rapidly build all of that up. But part of it, my students were really enamored of the idea, my high schoolers years ago, of a disability history museum, a national museum. And they wrote a piece for the New York Times about it. I'm amazed. Awesome. 11th graders. I've always been uncomfortable with that because I think this is about community, and I'm not as interested, I guess, in what goes on the National Mall. And to that end, I don't have an answer for every one of them. What I have is an answer of, I guess, of like what they should be, but an answer of process, which is the survivors must go first in dictating what the future of those places is. And if the survivors in a local community say, we want it all to be housing. That happened up at Danvers, where a lot of the survivors of the institution said afterward, like, we want the state to address the cemetery, same sort of issue. And we want this turned into housing. And they were denied that. And it was turned into other things. They said, we need a place to live. We don't have anywhere to live. We're broke. We got out of an institution. If they say that, great. If they say tear it all down, tear it all down. I don't care what a community arrives at. I care about the community having the conversation, and I care about that conversation being centered around deference to building a better world the way that the former inmates, is what they were called on census forms for so long, inmates of these institutions, clients, residents, whatever you want to say, what they think that ought to be. And I think we could start to build a lot better that way. But it's a thought. I don't know, and it's not a finished one. Yeah. Maybe one or two more questions. Maybe someone near the back. Yeah.
I always think of that documentary that Frederick Wiseman made in the 60s, Titicut Follies. By the 60s, things get better, the conditions at these institutions from the 30s.
No, by the 60s. So wild connection is that Fernald's idea of defective delinquency morphs into an idea that we need a separate department of defective delinquency, not under the Department of Mental Diseases, but under the prisons. And they build that department at Bridgewater State Hospital, which is what's being filmed in the Titicut Follies. And when that was filmed, of course, just so you all know the connections on privacy and the making up of privacy law out of whole cloth, which is a long honored tradition in Massachusetts, the people from the institution saw the records, saw the film that Wiseman made. He's a lawyer. He's our great documentary filmmaker. He's in his 90s now. And they saw the conditions. They said, yeah, that looks about right what it is. And it's released and everybody panics because they kill someone on camera in the Department of Defective Delinquents. At which point the Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General Elliot Richardson, who's eyeing higher office in Washington, panics, makes up privacy law out of whole cloth, shuts the film down and says, you can't screen it anywhere for decades, right? Because it reveals the conditions of what's going on in there. No, by that point, what's happening is the beginning of something we've told in the wrong way, which is, yes, there is the rising parents movement busting into these places. And that is a big thing. Like, mothers are fighting like hell and demanding to see inside, but also people are keeping their kids who have less pronounced disabilities from ever being thrown into an institution. And what that does, that was called the patient mix. That is a very kind word for, I have a file from a big civil rights leader in this name, Gunnar Dibwad, that's labeled slavery. And it is about this, which is, once you don't have those more able-bodied disabled people to do the enslaved labor to run the institution, it collapses. So by the 60s, what's happening is they're collapsing around them because they don't have the enslaved labor. And the first thing they do is they bring in prisoners who are nearing parole from places like MCI Concord. And they say, well, you're near parole, so if you're good, you can run the place. And I just talked to a woman who reached out after seeing the article in the New York Times about this. She ran the whole program. She was a junior at Tufts. No one was in charge, right? A kid took this over and was like, I'll take care of the prisoners. We'll run the institutions. No, they horrible, horrible, horrible places. And what the former Secretary of Health and Human Services said to me, because she began her career running the Met State Hospital across the road, was that it was run by criminal gangs of employees who were related to each other and who were running illicit substances in and out of the institutions and using them as a staging ground for all kinds of horrible things. And so, no, much awful, unconscionable. And two types of people go into these places. And I want to be clear about this because it's easy to demonize one whole group, which is the opposite of what this material should do. People who are really, really good people who care a lot about people and will go back, which is mind blowing to me, and really bad people. And it's an odd mixture of those two things. So maybe one more question. We'll do one more. Sorry, everyone. I know there's lots of questions. Thank you.
First of all, the book is amazing.
Thank you so much.
Really was just, I worked there for a year when I was in the early 80s, in between jobs.
Why'd you go back? My question always about this exactly. So you had a first day that was probably not very good. Why'd you go back?
I needed the money.
Needed the money. Yeah.
But once you get in there, I mean, I found, you know, we called them clients at the time. And they needed help, and you know, and I don't know. I mean, you know, an individual can make a difference, and you do the best you can.
Yeah.
And so that was impressive. I think the one thing, and you mentioned in the book, and I think you were talking about this, is that you really have to understand who was sort of qualified to be placed in the institution. And even when I was there, there were people there who were deemed to be disabled because they were not within the societal norm, right? There were a lot of, you know, girls who were, you know, they were probably 14 years old and they were sexually, you know, advanced, and the parents couldn't take care of them. So they would be, you know, parents would say, we're you know, the end of our rope, and they would actually be sent to Fernald.
Yes.
And I actually met some of them, and, you know, they were not disabled. They became disabled because they were institutionally impacted. And that's the thing that's the thing I think gets forgotten, that there's people who really should not have even been in there in the first place. They ended up there, which is sad.
I want to take that and run with that as a great last point, which is this is the distinction. And I want to add more to it, which is no one deserves to be in them. No one deserves to be in them for just that reason, which is that there is no criteria for being in one. The only criteria that we can define, and there's all kinds of disability studies on this. I find it fascinating. I love it. I love reading it. We don't need to go into all of it. There are disabilities that really exist, and there are disabilities that are socially constructed. And in this history, it matters most to me that society decided to call these folks disabled. And when I sit with people, and I've sat with a lot of survivors of these institutions where they're not literate, and I've read their files to them, their patient file, I say, what's my disability? I say, I don't know. The only one I can tell you is what you just said, which is you were institutionalized. And that is disabling because it's so horrible. What has happened to you, the loss of autonomy, everything that comes with that, even on its best days, that is the one takeaway that I have. And we have control over that one thing, right? We don't have to do that, and we shouldn't do that. And so I appreciate your point very much. And I think, no one should be in any of these places. I was in for 4 days, I think, or 5 days. And in that period, you realize very quickly how the thing itself is violent to everyone who is in it. It makes you complicit in everything. As an inmate, you are immediately invited in and forced to engage in violence against other people. It is its way of operating. There is no other way for it. And I will take Fernald's very hard-fought crashing utopia as that example, that this man is the true believer who spends his whole life on this, exports it everywhere in the world, and ends his life getting up in front of everybody saying, don't do it. And so we shouldn't do it. Thank you all for coming. Everybody.
I just wanted to thank you, Alex, for sharing this very difficult but vitally important research, and for your advocacy, and our gratitude for all of you for coming tonight, as well as all of our online viewers as well. Programs like this are made possible due to the support of friends like you, and information about upcoming programs are all available on Mass Historical's website, www.masshist.org. So Alex will be signing copies of his book in the lobby. Please note that our building will close at 7:45 p.m. And thank you again for joining us tonight. And I hope you return often. Thank you.